to us about challenges faced by women in the Muslim majority world, not only USA, but he is a speaker and writer on issues ranging from education and national security to faith and identity politics, among other capacities. I know him very well in here. I saw him on TV many times, on YouTube, addressing large scholarly people and schools and universities. Now I wonder why in 2013, Sami H. Elmansoury was inducted as a World Young Leader by the BMW Foundation for his educational work and social activism, and he is a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post. So without any further questions,
firstly, I just wanted to say thank you very much to the organizers for putting together what is a very important conversation. And when I was doing a little bit of research beforehand, I found that this is not a gathering that happens often enough. I think that there's a tendency, and it's a very legitimate one, to think that, you know, because of all of the scrutiny in the media and because of all the issues that unfortunately have happened, and more pronounced, I should say, in the years since 9/11, that, but to do a conversation like this is to fall into the hands of others who have different motives than positive ones. That to talk about the rights of Muslim women means, or is equating to essentially falling into that colonial paradigm where the woman who is of the Islamic faith needs to be saved. And I think that that's a very legitimate and valid point, because a lot of the critics today, unfortunately, their intentions and their words are cherry-picked, are often not representative of the whole, and while sometimes the points that are raised are legitimate, they're packaged in a certain way that is extremely against the community on whole. And I think that's the way that we look at that phobia, that constant fear that the Muslim woman is someone who needs to be liberated and saved. I think that that's something that, as American Muslims, we have a great opportunity to change that and to take ownership of the conversation on Muslim women as Muslims. I think that that's the critical key for the future. So that was kind of my disclaimer, but I am tasked with the challenging, one of the most challenging parts, I believe, of the day today, and that is to discuss some of the realities on the ground in the Muslim majority world, some of the challenges that are faced, in fact, by Muslim women across the region, in both the Middle East and in South Asia, across parts of Europe and in other places in Africa, and in many places where Muslims are a majority. There are challenges that women face across the world, without exception. It is a fact that the struggle for the equality of human worth is something that's far from complete. For example, here in the United States, we have a population where women make approximately 80% of what men make. Now, that's a far cry from what it used to be, but there's a long way to go. You also have rising levels of domestic violence here in the United States against women of all faiths and traditions and backgrounds. So you have domestic violence in places where, unfortunately, there's lack of accountability. You have cases of rape where, unfortunately, the facts often get brushed under the table. And you have many other challenges as well. Stepping beyond that, you have a Congress where only 20% of the representation are women, in a population where it's split about equally. And so that tells you again that we have a long way to go. Going to the American Muslim dynamic, you also have some level of challenges. We talk about progress, but in some regards, some things have often been. In 1994, for example, only 50% of mosques excluded women, in the sense that they put them in a completely separate area, kind of almost what they would call a penalty box. Fast forwarding 6 years, you had 2/3 of mosques did that. So, you know, this was something, and unfortunately, since that time, the numbers have been a little obscure, but you show again this trend that unfortunately we still have work to do within our communities. However, here in the United States, we have moved in a positive direction when it comes to overall women's opportunity, and I'm going to use that word opportunity a lot, because I'm not going to apply someone else's definition of what liberation means, of what freedom means. To be honest, the reality is it's access to opportunity. That's really what shows whether a society is doing right by its women or not. And here in the US, the gender inequity in 2009, we were listed about 31st in the United States. That's moved up to 19th today, which is something that is really a positive, a net positive. And I want to say from the get-go, my data and my research is largely coming, it's not coming from the camps out there that ultimately want to disparage Muslims or Islam. It's coming from organizations like the UNDP, the UNHRC, and also some of these statistics are coming from Pew Research, where many Muslims have been involved. Some of the things that I wanted to bring forward and bring to light. Just this decade, the Pew Research Group did a massive study, and they polled and researched, and they are a respectable organization, so I do take some of their work quite seriously. Many of the Muslim communities across countries that are Muslim majority or have a sizable Muslim minority. And I have to say, in studying this research, and actually, to be honest, the recent controversy that happened with Bill Maher, as many are aware of his comments, that actually came from, his data came from that Pew, the one that he brought out there came from that Pew study. However, he did inflate it by about 20%. But some of the numbers coming in that Pew study were troubling when it comes to perceptions within societies about Muslim women. So for example, you have numbers that, for example, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and other countries, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, the numbers are upwards of 90% said that a woman should unconditionally support her husband and obey him. And the word is actually obey when it was polled. Tunisia, Morocco, Iraq, Egypt, Jordan also reflected numbers well above 80%. I'm going to always do both sides. So you have, at the same time, places like Kosovo, Albania, Bosnia, the numbers were more in the 30 and 40%. And this is, again, if the husband even brings and pushes the wife towards something that is negative or against her own interests, she must obey him. You have places such as Indonesia, where only 30% of the population believes a woman has the right to a divorce. 26% in Pakistan, 22% in Egypt, 22% in Jordan, 14% in Iraq. Some of the positives that I found, 81% believe so in Tunisia, 73% in Morocco, 85% in Turkey, 80% in Azerbaijan, and 94% in Bosnia. So again, you see that, and again, I'm not, unlike some folks who try to bring out only the negative statistics, I'm trying to give both. So men having more right to jobs, and particularly to be factual when they're scarce, but men having more right to employment and more right to jobs, meaning that an employer should prefer a man over a woman in the workplace. 81% believe so in Pakistan, 86% believe so in Tunisia, 79% believe so in Egypt, 66%, 87% in Pakistan believe that a family should choose a woman's husband, 73% in Jordan. And the numbers are also similar across the board, which for most of the women often did vote, I would argue, and I don't mean to say this in any patronizing way, but I think against their own interests in cases of even the right to a divorce. It was surprising. So you have, though, at the same time, some of the disparity between the men and the women statistics are upwards of 20+% between men and women in the gap in the polls. So it shows you again that men's perceptions are very different from the women's perceptions. Places like Pakistan, 42% I should say, believe that men have a better life. 14% believe that women have a better life, and the same was about 38%. Egypt, 36% believe men have a better life, 13% believe that women have a better life. Now, it was the reverse in Tunisia and Lebanon, believe it or not. About 67% of men are literate. Now, that number is debatable, but that's the unofficial statistic. 42% of women, so 67% versus 42%. In Morocco, it's 61% to 35%. In Yemen, it's 66% of men are literate, 23% of women are literate. In Libya, 90% of men, 66% of women. In Tunisia, where, again, look at the last statistics, there seems to be often more opportunity for women. It holds that 80% of men are literate and only 59% of women are literate. So that, again, raised my eyebrows. Lastly, workforce. When you look at employment opportunity in the Muslim majority world, you often have a challenging dynamic. 51% of men in Egypt have exclusive and sole participation in the economic, that means jobs and providing and all those other things. 22% of women in Egypt. 43% of men in Libya, 12% of men in Egypt. In Oman, 42% of men are part of the exclusive economic participation, 8%, Syria, 44% to 16%. All right, so I'm moving away from perceptions. It's a lot. So overall, when you look at the legislative systems of many countries in the Muslim majority world, you find that women, let's be clear, are often treated as kind of, for example, in family law, penal law, citizenship law, domestic violence laws, all of these things. Women often don't get their cases heard, or maybe, for example, they might be brushed under the table. The facts often go towards or in favor of the men. Now, for example, with domestic violence, there's a glaring lack of women's shelters for those who actually face domestically abusive relationships. There's often a blame the victim mentality, and if you look at story after story, statistic after statistic, very often if the woman, for example, is alone with a man, even in a car, her driver perhaps, it will often be, well, why were you alone with him in the car? As opposed to, why did he actually assault you or abuse you? And that's completely unacceptable. Spousal rape is often not criminalized. In fact, it's most often not criminalized. And the idea often is given that, well, a woman is to be obedient to the man, to look back to our perceptions polls. So if there's spousal rape, it's often not criminalized. In fact, there's often a shame to even bring it forward. If a rapist, in many of the countries that are Muslim majority, if a rapist agrees to marry his victim, it's often dropped. The case is often dropped. So basically, if she's compelled by shame to marry him and he agrees, then there's no charge. And in most of the countries, with the exception of, I believe, 4, citizenship is only passed through the father. If you look at different countries, each country has a different scenario. And I don't like going on anecdotal evidence. I like going on facts and statistics and numbers. And even if those are troubling, crime happens everywhere. Things happen everywhere. But the anecdotes that I found to be interesting were the ones that denoted perception, the way that people actually view the worth of a woman. And in 2002, for example, there was a case of a school that was burning down. Some people might have heard of this. And there were 15 schoolgirls inside. And the religious police, they're the Saudi Arabian religious police, called in Arabic Amr Ma'ruf Nahy Anil Munkar, for enjoining the good, forbidding the evil. Now, you would have thought enjoining the good would have meant to save these young girls' lives, but rather, because they weren't, quote-unquote, properly dressed, they were left inside the school and they all perished. 15 of them perished because they were not properly dressed to exit the school. This is not just a one-off type of a story. This happens in many, many places where, unfortunately, the woman's life is put secondary to certain laws or certain perceptions of what she should be. In South Asia, you have cases like with Lashkar-e-Jabbar, I'm sorry my Urdu is not on point, and the Taliban and other groups that have frequently put on, and this was mentioned earlier, acid attacks against women who might be considered beautiful and they don't cover their face. And there is story after story of acid attacks. Unfortunately, in many cases, again, the woman is ashamed to bring cases like this forward, so she says it's an accident or whatever it might be. But there was, this is something that happens often. Now, I want to, for full disclosure, say that this is something that also happens in Hindu-majority India. So it's not necessarily something that only happens in the Muslim world. However, it's often sanctioned through religious reasons, that she is the one who is doing sexual impropriety. And that's where the problems come in, when people begin to use the religion in order to justify such disgusting violence. In Lebanon, you cannot get divorced for a domestic abuse case unless you have an eyewitness of the domestic abuse. Even if your doctor has come forward and said she was abused, this is a bruise that's coming from her husband, etc., etc. That's not enough. In Egypt, a woman can initiate a divorce, but unfortunately, she has to renounce everything, which means even the couple's joint finances they worked on together, she has to renounce that. She also has to pay back her dowry, which could be an argument to be made, but unfortunately, many of the women can't afford to do so. Because they're already poor, they're already in a situation where they might be less privileged than their husbands, they can't afford to pay back the dowry, which means they're stuck. Men can also, in Egypt, go to the consulate, essentially, and forbid their wives from traveling. So if the woman would like to exit the country for whatever reason, he can actually have a written statement saying that he forbids her husband. That extends to Iraq, Libya, Morocco, Oman, Yemen, Bahrain, and several other countries as well. In Afghanistan, there's a reluctance to send girls to school, often because it's considered that after puberty, she no longer on the other side. They think that if she goes out, that means that she's going to be attacked, and so they don't send her to school because of that. There's also a weird dynamic, because you have a situation where, unfortunately, on one front, you have a reluctance to send women to school because they shouldn't be taught by men, but at the same time, there's a cultural reluctance to have women teachers. So you don't know, it's kind of one of those cases where you're darned if you do, darned if you don't know how to win that one. Only 18% of women in Afghanistan between 15 to 24 are literate. And this is Malaysia is 60% Muslim. So you have a majority, but there's a large dynamic of Buddhists and other communities. So the Malaysian government did something interesting. They separated the laws, where you have one law applying to the non-Muslims, one law applying to the Muslims. Now the interesting thing that happened is that at the same time after that happened, the progress of the non-Muslim women in society, their economic opportunity, their job opportunities, their political opportunities rose. And the Muslim women's opportunities went down drastically. So because they separated, so they're actually considering it to be an interfaith gender apartheid in Malaysia. Lastly, in Bahrain, women can lose custody for arbitrary reasons. The judge just decides that the man now gets the children and the woman can lose her children. So if the man says she's a bad mom, enough said. Women actually who challenge this custody law, interestingly enough, are often sued by the man's family for slander against the man's family, and more often than not, the man's family wins the case. This is a term that's very loaded, and I actually despise the term. However, because there's no honor in it, and I think you guys know what I'm about to use, which term I'm going to use. The honor killing. The question of honor killing. In the United States, or North America, I should say, 49% of femicide, they call it killing of women without real just cause or without trial or due process, 49% is sourced from the family. So an abusive husband or a father or something where there's some sort of assault and the woman is killed, 49% is sourced from within the family. In the Muslim majority world, it's 72% is sourced from within the family. In North America, however, the argument is not usually sexual impropriety. Very often it's a drunken argument or some sort of a case of other abuse, but 9% of the cases here in North America is the excuse made that it's sexual impropriety. In Muslim majority world, 57% of the time the man comes forward and says the woman was unfaithful. And in so many of those cases it's been proven that it's not true. The other excuses that are made for these so-called honor killings in the Muslim majority world is that she's too independent. She's not subservient enough. These are actual cases. She refused to dress in a certain way. She has non-Muslim friends. She refused to marry a cousin. She went and married a non-Muslim, or she left her abusive husband. Lastly, I want to comment that there is progress. All of this should keep in our minds that there are these challenges that must be addressed, that we have to be real about. That it's not a non-Muslim thing, or the Western thing that there's coming forward and that there's this issue that these Muslim women all need to be saved. In reality, I understand that that's a challenging paradigm, and I don't want other people to be saving us. But let's save ourselves. And that's the point that has to be emphasized. Because, for example, in Saudi Arabia, you've recently had 20% of women are now on the Shura Council. That was unprecedented before. Now they are permitted to ride bikes. That was unpermitted before. May the cars be next. They have opened women's sports clubs. They also started their first anti-domestic violence campaign. In Iran, the dynamic has shifted where now 60% of university students are women. In Malaysia, they just appointed in 2010 the first 2 female judges in the country's history. Things like that, and there's much more. There is progress. There are individuals like Manal Sharif who has stood up in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf about women's rights. Young girls like Malala Yousafzai and others who inspire us and show us the type of courage just in saying no, and just in saying that we deserve better than this. And I want to comment, I had written a piece a few months ago, I should say, for Huffington Post, and it was relating to this issue exactly because I find that often there is this feeling of, when we look at the gender disparity in our communities, there's often this feeling that any type of conversation, again, is selling out. We have to come to terms on something as a Muslim community, all of us, and that is that women are of equal worth to men. Point blank, no questions asked. It can no longer be something of debate. This should be in political circles, in religious circles, in family circles, everywhere. That when there's a discussion on women's rights, women should always be at the table. It really is absurd to see a discussion on women's rights that only includes men, including at the scholarly level. That women, because they share the earth, deserve the same respect as men. And that lastly, when we look at the question of women's rights, we're not selling out by admitting to ourselves that there are challenges, not that we are responsible for, because we cannot possibly save the world alone, but that in rising up, we are fulfilling our obligations as Muslims to stand up to injustices, not just committed by others against the Muslim community, but to stand up to injustices that are done from within against ourselves. Thank you. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.